know, the day that the bombs dropped on Pearl Harbor, I had just turned 16. About your age, if not your age. It never dawned on me that I would ever be caught up in a world war. The fact is, when the bombs dropped, I was out northeast of a little town called Ortonville in Minnesota hunting jackrabbits. But it wasn't long before all the able-bodied men and women of my town began to drift into the service. And women played a major role. There's no girls here that I could at all, so there was a bunch of them last time. I should have told them how important they were. They were WACs and they were waves and they were nurses and Red Cross girls and they were cute. in those WAC uniforms that they had. So finally, I had to quit my senior year in high school to go to work for my dad in his meat market and his slaughtering house. I was working 60, 70 hours a week, scalding hogs and butchering cows and carrying quarters of beef that weighed more than I did, and I only weighed 122 pounds. I could hardly wait to get in the war. Well, I enlisted in the Army Air Corps. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I think every kid in America wanted to be a fighter pilot. When I got into the induction center in Fort Snelling, I flunked the physical. As a kid, I fell out of a tree and got a compound fracture of this arm, and I have a handicap. And I said, well, the major, the doctor that was with me, and I said, I want to be a fighter. Sorry, soldier. He said, we can offer you limited service. You can drive a truck. You can type. I said, I want to be a fighter. Sorry, soldier. Have to put that on your record. So from there, the first step in a soldier's life is military, is basic training. My basic training took place in Keesler Field, down in Mississippi. Kids from all over the country, new recruits, assembled at the parade ground. First day, we're looking at each other. The kid from Boston couldn't speak the language. It wasn't a bottle with a metal cap, it was a bottle with a metal cap. The kid from the South, his accent was so difficult, we couldn't understand it. And the kid from Texas, big, tall, mean guy. Nobody liked him. You could immediately, when you looked at him. Kid from Oregon, from Clascanine, Oregon, was a farm boy, strange-looking dude. And guess what? I was from Minnesota, and they thought everybody were Scandinavian at the time, and so I was Minnesota Dutch. Well, finally, the purpose there was to shape us up. And that kid from Boston over there in New Haven, Connecticut, carried my backpack for me when I couldn't do it. And that meat kid from Texas would hold me up when I was trying to do 100 push-ups. And it wasn't long, the focus wasn't on each other, but it was on, let's see, this team, drill sergeant. And that was the purpose of basic training, to shape everybody up and ship them out. They shipped me out to gunnery school in Las Vegas, Nevada. And my best friend that I'd been with, that was Bud Riley, and we would go to town, and on $24.85 after they took out our $50 for an 1850 war bond, and for insurance policy for $6.40, we got a $10,000 insurance policy, which was a pretty good investment considering where we were heading. We would go to town, and one roll of the dice, and our money would be gone. Well, one day Bud came to me, and he was dangling a $20 bill in my face. It says, Parker, we're rich. His mother had tucked it in the folds of a letter. We went to town, we could even ride horseback now. Soon he was coming with every letter. She would tuck in a $20 bill, sometimes twice a week. We were wealthy. We went to town, we rode horseback, and we went to the gambling hall. We even went to a girly show. But Mrs. Riley would have been confused if she'd have seen what her son was doing with the money, but she needn't have worried, because it wasn't long with droopy eyes and tired feet. We were heading back to the base for our next assignment. Well, our next assignment was in Dyersburg, Tennessee, a sleepy little town in northwestern part by the Ohio River. We came together for the first time as crews. 10 men served on a B-17. Bud was scheduled to be a tail gunner, and so was I, and sure enough, that's what happened. We didn't fly on the same bomber, of course, because you can only have one tail gunner. And we learned to fly in formation. The navigators did navigation. They do celestial navigation at night. We went out over the Gulf of Mexico and we would do simulating bombing so we could learn to live together as a team. And one day Bud came to me and he was crying. And guys didn't cry. We were 18, 19 years old. I said, Bud, what's the problem? He said, well, my sister came down here to see me off to war. She's been here 3 days, and she's in love with coal pipe. She wants to marry me. I said, Bud, call your mother. He said, I did. All she could do was bawl. They got married. Circumstance. Things happened fast in World War II. The women were especially concerned because there was a shortage of men. And so what happened, now Bud and his brother-in-law were on the same aircraft, which was a no-no. After 5 Sullivan brothers went down to a watery grave in the Pacific during the war, they were on the same ship. And so they changed the rules. But this was circumstance. And so there it was. They flew together. Now, I'm going to talk to you about, let's see here. Oh, I'll tell you what, one experience when we were down in Dyersburg, we flew air to ground gunnery. And we would be right on the deck in the hills of Tennessee, and there were some barges in a river down there. And there were gasoline tanks on it. And we would fire our machine guns, and they would explode, and it was so exciting. And one day, one of my machine guns exploded. I held the trigger too long. Machine guns have to be fired in bursts. Brr, brr. If you hold them too long, you're going to cook off the round. It's going to be too hot in the breech. And that's what happened. It threw me back, tore my flying suit. I got pepper spots all over down there. It looked like varicose veins now. And they landed, and they gave me a tetanus shot. I couldn't get the Purple Heart because I wasn't in combat. Incidentally, 5 of my guys did get Purple Hearts. And other awards. Okay, now, let's see. I'm going to go right to my missions, spend a few minutes with those. Before I do that, I just noticed this picture here. When we came back from furlough after our experiences there, we went to Newport News on the East Coast and boarded a French liner called the AFHS-Mn. They told us the first one went down. We were happy about that. And Bud and I were watching the crew. It was a French crew. And they had a dice game going on the fantail when they weren't swabbing the deck up. Some of them couldn't make it to the rail. And we watched them intensely. Finally, one of those Frenchmen, and they were from Morocco, and handed me the dice because they saw how interested we were. Pass after pass. No mistakes. When the last Moroccan walked away, we had made $1,400. Well, the average paycheck in America in 1944 was $25 a week. We had a year's salary. So I offered Bud his $750 and he didn't want to take it. Well, I put it in his foot locker in the tent when he wasn't looking something. Later, I found out that he sent it home to work to my folks. He had enough money, I think. And when we got there, money didn't mean anything. They transferred it to LI military currency. It looked like monopoly money. So we did a lot of gambling and so forth. So anyway, we crossed the ocean. We hovered the coast of North Africa because they were in the Mediterranean, and then we raced across to Naples. We came into the harbor of Naples. It was a horrible mess. It was our first experience of war. Mussolini had been removed from power, and the Italian army caved in. And Hitler was so mad that he'd lost his ally that he ordered the city of Naples destroyed. And they did a job. When we came into the harbor, and you came in there too, Clemens, it was just a trail in and out. The whole harbor had sunken ships with poking out. We went down the gangplank, across the wharf, and down below, you could see smokestacks of a liner that was on its side, and we had built our wharf over the top of it. And running along beside us, and I have some pictures here of that, were little children. And the soldiers were passing out candy bars and cigarettes. They didn't smoke, but it was the coin of the realm. And here's 5 little girls on the streets of Naples, tattered clothes, messy hair, lice in their hair, holding on to each other, and they're smiling. Because the economy over there was really the American industry, our troops. And our troops. Well, we went inland, and we began to fly our missions. First of all, I'm going to tell you that I never had to fire my machine guns on an enemy aircraft for several reasons. One was they knew I was the best gunner in the entire world. The real reason was they didn't come in and shoot at the tail position very early in the war, because what happened was they would lose the forward speed that we had. Here's an example. The B-17 was traveling along about 150 miles an hour. They would come in out of the sun on pursuit curve at 350, and as they leveled off, they lost that 150. Now they're only doing 200 miles an hour. Well, we could shoot them effectively at 600 yards, and they had to get in within 300 yards to get a good shot. They didn't have a lot of ammunition. They did have the advantage of being able to empty their guns going down, and they were on their home base and come up again. But so they changed their tactics, and they began to come in and shoot at the pilot. They shot at Clemens. They missed him. Well, my first mission was November 18th. I had just turned 19. 4 days earlier, I was 18. The target was Florsdorf, Vienna. I was flying in a ship called Jack Haley's Comet. Some of the aircraft had, wow.
Black got you there.
Black got me. It was all around. The funny thing on that mission, there wasn't much flak, which was unusual. We almost always got hit. And so on the way back to the base, letting down, got off our oxygen. We had to wear oxygen up there because it was 50 below zero and no air. We were just getting off our oxygen mask, and I heard, "Get out, get out," on the intercom, our little communication system. And I turned and I looked and I saw a B-17 upside down on a flat spin, circle, and several parachutes outside of it. And all of a sudden the plane exploded. And I wrote a story about that somewhere over there. And it was printed in my 301st Bomb Group Association paper after the war. And one of the guys in those planes called me because he read that same publication. And he told me exactly what happened on that aircraft. He was the engineer on the one up above. What happened was the plane down here was trying to get some useful protection to be in with this other bomber. Slammed into it. The propellers up here killed the pilot and the co-pilot instantly. The ship flipped over, and that's when I saw it. And things like that would happen. And I'm just thankful it's not you. Now, oh yes, every 20 minutes or so in combat or on the way, the navigator and our crew would call for oxygen check. Everybody would report in to make sure they were okay. Well, one day, the radio guy didn't answer. So we went around again, and one of the waist gunners didn't answer. Now, something's wrong. The pilot called me, and he said, "Parker, what's going on back there?" Well, I could look through the bomber, past the tail wheel, into the waist, into the radio room. In Faust, the radio man was flat on the floor, unconscious. The waist gunner was trying to get oxygen into him. You don't live beyond 3 minutes or so without oxygen. We had emergency bottles we could run around with, hook into the main circuit. Well, when I reported that to the pilot, he said, "We're going down." And we went from 28 to 12,000 feet, way past the danger line that the ship should be flying, to save him, to get oxygen-rich air into him. Well, on the way down, the pilot called the crew and said, prepare to bail out. Well, I was always ready. I had my own escape hatch back there, right underneath the horizontal stabilizer. I could turn a handle and I could be out. And usually I had my parachute on one link and my body armor on the other because the shells are exploding. Plus there was a steel helmet. I tried to crawl up in that whole thing because this stuff was hitting all the time. Well, he said, on the way down, he said, prepare to bail out, but don't bail out unless you hear the emergency bell. Well, after the war, I'm reading what we did. We learned more about what happened to us in history. We were just little pieces, you know, of the whole picture we did. So I read that the circuitry in the bomber for the emergency bells did not reach the bell in the tail. I never would have heard it if you rang the bell. The other guys would have waved goodbye. It would have been nice. Okay, now, well, one day we took off for a target called Hagen's Hut at Hungary. It was a marshaling yard, railroad yard. We had to bomb it because they were shipping goods to the West Russian front, to northern Italy. So over the target, a shell exploded right under the lower ball turret. And the ball turret guy called up, and he said, has anybody got a windshield wiper up there? And hydraulic fluid from the brakes that were severed was all over his turret. Well, the pilot called me and he said, Parker, have you got your parachute back there? We were dropping back. We were in pretty bad shape. And I said, of course. He said, well, he said, we may have to rig it up and throw it out. I said, I'm going with it if you throw it out. He said, no, no. He said, don't worry. The engineer will come back with some parachute harnesses and wrap them around your guns, and there's a little door, little canopy in my position, and I could put this on the ledge. So what happened was, Clancy comes in, he's making a good landing, and I got the parachute on the ledge, on the ripcord handle, and he said, don't do it, Parker, unless I tell you. Don't throw it out. You've seen that in the movies where the parachute goes out to use as a brake. Well, he said, don't eat it. So I threw it down. We went full length of the runway. We didn't have tires or brakes. No one was wounded. We circled and stopped. Clancy ran back and called and grabbed me and said, Parker, you did a good job. I said, I didn't do anything. He said, that's what I mean. Well, let's see here. Okay, we bombed a target called Brux in Czechoslovakia on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1940. And what I would do over the target, the shells were always exploding. There's not going to be any fighter opposition. They're not going into their own exploding shells. I would wiggle past my ammunition boxes to get to my escape hatch, because anything could happen. Ships were going down, and I had an oxygen line that I had to keep sure that it was working, and there was a blinker on it. Every time I took a breath, it was like a pair of lips. And to kind of substitute fear with fantasy, I would pretend that was my girlfriend back home kissing me. And when I got back home, she was kissing somebody else. But that's the way it was. So, in addition to that, I would hear bomb bay doors open. Well, the bomb run was about 5 to 20 minutes. And I had a wristwatch that my mother had given me for Christmas. To think about this, it was Christmas Day, and my twin sister was back home under the Christmas tree without her twin brother. And mother had another son in England in a hospital in critical condition. His knee was blown off in France. And here it was, they were under the tree. And here's another son in harm's way up there. So, no bombs away. I would listen. So we circled. We went around the target again. And we came in, and I'm waiting. Bomb bay doors were open. No bombs away. We went around again. Nobody goes over a target 3 times. It's crazy. Captain Brenzinger, they called him Fearless Joe Brenzinger, was leading the group, and he had to have everything just right. Finally, we dropped the bombs. We got back, and after the war, I was in a restaurant bar down in Orlando, and I could hear Brenzinger's voice. And he was in the bar. And I walked over, he was a major. And I said, Major, where were you Christmas Day, 1944? He said, were you with me? He says, yeah. He said, were you mad? I said, yeah. And I said, when we got home, the mess hall was closed. He said, buy the sergeant a drink. And we went to places in the sky that very few had been. There was no rank. He wasn't a major. We were both generals or whatever you want to call us. We were buddies. Everybody came together to fight the war. Well, you know, finally, one day over Linz, Austria, February 25th, 1945, a shell exploded just below Bud's plane, between 3 and 4 inches. It was a terrible fire. The ship dropped down to about 2,000 feet. I was maybe 6,000 feet above it at the time. I didn't know it was him in that ship until later. It exploded. 3 parachutes got out. Now who lives and who dies? You don't know. Now Bud was in there. Brother-in-law was in there. I knew that whole crew because that kid from Minnesota, Schuler, was in there. Schuler got killed. Bud got killed. His brother-in-law survived. And we had made a deal that if either one of us got killed, we'd go to the other guy's home, you know, and talk to mom and dad about our relationship. But I didn't need to, I didn't think, because his brother-in-law would do that for me. And every time that I put out the flag on special days, that flag right there, I look up at the sky and I see Bud and he's dangling a $20 bill in my face. Parker, we're rich. And I have to say this, yes, we are rich. And guess what? Because of all the Bud Rileys down through the ages, we're free. Thank you.
I'm Bob Clemens. I graduated from White Bear High School in May of 1942, and I entered the Army Air Force in November of 42. Went on and took training and became an aerial navigator. Got my commission in my wings when I was 19 years old in February of 1944. And in that same month, joined a crew at Sioux City, Iowa, and trained in the B-17 Flying Fortress like the one you see here on the table. It was a marvelous aircraft. It had the latest of everything for that time. It's pretty old-fashioned today by today's standards. It was a large aircraft at that time. It's a wingspan of almost 104 feet, a length of over 74 feet, and a height at the tail of 19 feet. 4 1,200 horsepower engines, carried 6,000 pounds of bombs, and almost 2,800 gallons of gasoline. About 12,000 were manufactured, 6,000 were lost in World War II. Over 8,000 of them were made like this one up here, the G model, with the turret under the chin of the airplane. And they had to put that on because when the Germans made a head-on attack without that turret, it was tough to fight them off. So not fairly early in the war, they went to the G model. That airplane carried 10 crewmen, and it had 13 50 caliber machine gun shells. This is a 50 caliber shell, effective at about 600 yards. We had 13 of those machine guns on board. This is a 20 millimeter shell. This is what the German fighters fired against us. They're effective at about 300 yards, but they tear a hole about that big around in an airplane. The training in the Air Force, I thought, was very well done. It was done in a hurry. After it was part of the Army, and so you went to Army basic training. And after basic training, they sent you to what was called College Training Detachment. I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and we were there for about 4 months, and where you brushed up on your math and your physics. Now, math was my favorite subject in high school, and so I wanted to be a navigator. And fortunately, when they came to the time when they told us what we would be qualified for. I qualified for bombardier, navigator, and a pilot, and they let me take my choice, and so I was a navigator. One of the most interesting parts of the training was pre-flight. After you were classified, you went to pre-flight. I went to Ellington Field in Houston, Texas. Much like 9 weeks of pre-flight training, much like Marine boot camp. You're on the run all the time. Running, boxing, all kinds of physical exercise, and then a lot of book work too, a lot of studying. I thought that was one of the best parts of the training because we were in tip-top shape then. I weighed about 10 pounds more than I do now, but it was all muscle then. It's kind of flabby today. By the way, Vince hadn't mentioned our age. Vince is a young guy. Are you 86 yet?
Yeah, just made.
Just made 86. And I'm 87. I'll be 88 in March. But we were kind of young in those days. We were on the young side. The average age of a bomber crew was probably 23 or 24. Our pilot, my pilot was 28. He was an old man. The group commander was 35. He was really an old man. He was a colonel who'd been in the service a long time. Well, what was it like to be in combat? Well, I think, Vince, your pictures show how we lived in tents. We lived in tents in Italy. The crew on a B-17 had 4 officers and 6 enlisted men, but we didn't pay any attention to rank because we were all together. Most of the enlisted men were at least staff sergeants, and the officers were flight officers, second lieutenants, first lieutenants. Some of them were captains and majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels, but those were we were all together. A typical mission, they would wake us up about 3 o'clock in the morning. We would shave first because we wore those oxygen masks and didn't want to have any whiskers in the way of that mask, so it would clamp tight to your face. And then we'd go to breakfast about 4 o'clock and then on to briefing. And the briefing room had a big map up in front covered by a sheet, and they dropped the sheet, and then you could tell how tough the mission would be by the expression of the men. If there were a lot of oohs and ahs, it was probably a tough one. If there were a lot of smiles, it looked like it would be an easy one. Now that didn't always turn out to be that way. Some of the easy ones, supposedly easy ones, turned out to be tough ones, and some of the tough ones turned out to be easy. I would say that probably none of them were, I wouldn't say any of them were really easy. We always had some ground fire. Now, from the briefing, we would move on to the airplane and get in the airplane, and they would shoot up a yellow flare telling us to get ready. When they shot a green flare up, then you started to taxi toward the runway. The runways were about a mile long, and they were made out of corrugated steel with big holes in the steel. Now, they're different than concrete runways because they aren't that smooth. They went like this. They were about a mile long. The runway at the field I was at was an old Italian air base, but they had fighters there, and the runways weren't long enough, so the engineers had to grade some more of the ground and get the runways level for us. That was another thing that was amazing to me, how fast they did things, the people on the ground. They did a fabulous job. So as you got to the end of the runway, you waited for the plane ahead of you, the one that was taking off, to get at the opposite end of the runway, and then you started to taxi, or started the engines and started down the runway, usually about 30 seconds apart. Now, sometimes that one at the end of the runway didn't make it, and if it crashed, that didn't make any difference. You still took off. When you took off, you began to circle over a pylon to get to altitude and form up in a group. That usually took about an hour, and you would get into formation somewhere between 8 and 10,000 feet. Somewhere between 8 and 12,000 feet, you put on your oxygen mask. You realize, I'm sure, that the planes were not pressurized, and so you had to be on that oxygen. If you were on an 8-hour mission, you usually were in oxygen about 6 hours. About an hour before you got to altitude and about an hour after you got down low enough. So you had about 6 hours in an 8-hour mission. If you were on a 10-hour mission, you had about 8 hours on the oxygen mask. The typical mission, you would start after you formed up somewhere between 8 and 12,000 feet. You started your flight toward the target. Now, the targets in Italy were almost all of them over the Alps. The only time you didn't fly over the Alps is when you went east to, there was a famous target called Polesti, Romania. That was oil fields that had been built by Shell and Standard Oil in the late 20s and early 30s, which Hitler took over when he took over all the Balkan countries. That was a tough target. The 15th Air Force made 19 raids over Polesti until before the Russians took it over, and then we stopped bombing it. I was on 5 of those 19 missions, and a pretty fortunate guy that I never even got a wound over Polesti. It was a tough target. They defended it very well. We would have flames and smoke in the air 30,000 feet when we'd leave the target. We'd go back in 3 or 4 days and they were operating at full capacity. The Romanians and the Germans were amazing how they could put out those fires. Well, when you got close to the target, you went to the initial point, the IP, and that was some 6 to 20 minutes from the target. There you opened the bomb bay doors, and the bombardier steered the airplane left and right. He couldn't steer it up and down, but he steered it left and right. There was no evasive action while you were flying from the initial point to the target. You had to keep the plane straight and level. There was no evasive action. And so that's when the flak would be very heavy, the ground fire. Now the ground fire that the Germans used were artillery shells, 88 millimeter and 105 millimeter. Now an 88 millimeter shell is about this long, it's about this big around, it weighs about 30 pounds, it's half full of explosives and the other half of it is full of junk, pieces of concrete, steel, cast iron, aluminum, whatever there was. And that 88 or 105 millimeter shell would go off at a certain altitude or when it hit an airplane. Now, how did they know what altitude we were at? If you've ever seen an airplane flying at high altitude, you notice what we call the contrails. That's the hot gases coming out of the airplane into the cold air, because the air is cold. In the summertime when I was flying, the temperature at 25,000 feet would be 30 to 40 below zero. In the wintertime when Vince flew, the temperature might be 50 or 60 below zero Fahrenheit at 25,000 feet. Now, we wore heated suits, and the electrical system on the airplane was much like in cars today. It was 12 volt, and we plug our suits in. And Vince has a boot that we wore. This was hooked to your suit, to your electric suit, and it was meant to keep your feet warm. Now you also had to have a pair of regular boots on in case you were shot down, because you're going to do some walking in it. But those, that bomb run would be a terrifically tough time. It would seem like a long time because the anti-aircraft fire was intense. Now, you did not get any fighter opposition while you were on the IP because they didn't want to get hit by the flak. But when you came off the target, what the German fighters were waiting for was what they called cripples. That means an airplane that had an engine out or two engines out or was shot up badly and couldn't keep up with the formation. And they'd get after you then. I want to tell you a little bit about a mission I flew to Budapest toward the end of June of 1944. Now, I flew my bombing missions, 50 of them, between June 16th, 1944 and September 12th, 1944. June 16th, 10 days after D-Day. We were on a mission to Budapest, Hungary. We were going to bomb what we call the marshalling yards. That's where they put freight trains together to deliver supplies to the various parts of their economy. When we got to the target, we were scheduled to bomb at 23,000 feet. When we got there, at 23,000 feet, we were between two layers of clouds, one above us and one below us. And as we got close to the target, the group commander, the colonel, decided that we'd go around and get under that layer of clouds below us. While we were at 23,000 feet between those two layers of clouds, there were twin-engine German bombers above us dropping bombs on us. So we circled the target for 20 minutes. Now, 20 minutes doesn't seem like very long, but when they're firing a lot of anti-aircraft at you, it's like a lifetime. And that was a tough time to take on all that flak, as we called it. We got to the target, again, letting down to 13,000 feet. We were under the clouds that had been below us. And just as we got to the target, our number 3 engine was shot out. It was shot badly and had to feather the prop. Consequently, when we dropped our bombs, we couldn't keep up with the rest of the group. And so we were alone. We were one of those cripples. And that's when 4 German aircraft attacked us. 1 Me-109 and 3 FW-190s. Firing these shells. They did report that our gunners got the Me-109. They confirmed that. Probably the guys in the waist are the top turret gunner. As we were struggling to keep up, to stay aloft, we lost number 1 engine, and one of those fighters shot a hole in the propeller on number 1 engine. So we had number 1 and number 3 engines out. And the plane would fly on 2 engines, but it wouldn't keep altitude very well. At that point, we were down to about 10,000 feet. The Alps that we had to go over in northern Italy were about, the highest ones were about, as I recall it, about 11,700 feet. I plotted a course around those higher Alps so that we could get back to Italy. We did remove a lot of the stuff in the airplane and threw it out to make the airplane lighter. We did get back to home base with that airplane, and fortunately only 2 minor wounds to crewmen. That airplane had about 30 or 35 holes this big from these 20mm shells, and it had about 300 holes about that big from the anti-aircraft fire. Now, the amazing thing to me was that the ground crew put that airplane back to work, back in flying condition in 2 weeks. They changed 2 engines, and they patched over 300 holes to make that aircraft ready to go again. And so it was an amazing job that they did. The crew chief on that airplane...
Thumbs up, I say. Love it. I gotta go to an interview, but you guys are awesome.
Thank you.
I want to eat whatever you eat the rest of my life and do everything you've done. Sharp? Wow.
Let's go to lunch.
Hey.
The crew chief on that airplane told me about 25 years ago, he told me that when that airplane was all shot up, he worked 56 hours without going to bed. Now that was typical of what the men on the ground did, and that was typical of what the Army and the Marines did on the ground, and the Navy did on ships. Amazing cooperation between the armed services, and although many people seem to get more thrill out of talking to people in the Air Force, we weren't the only ones that were fighting. It was a combined effort. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the losses that we had. We had about 1,100 operational heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s in Italy. In July of 1944, we lost 318 of those 1,100 bombers, and in August of 1944, we lost another over 300. So about a 30% loss in each one of those months. Now, the amazing part of it was when you lost an airplane, there was always a new one to go there. I remember the people in Yugoslavia used to count us going to the target. They'd count us when we came back, and when there were airplanes missing, then they said, but the next morning there'd be just as many going to the target. We just had an awful lot of equipment. We had airplanes, we had spare engines, we had spare parts, we had plenty of gasoline. You know, the B-17 carried 6,000 pounds of bombs. It carried 2,800 gallons of 100-octane gasoline, and boy, did that 100-octane gasoline burns. It has a low temperature where it starts on fire, and so it burns pretty fast. You know, we use in our cars today mostly 82-octane gasoline, and so you can imagine how what power that the gasoline had. The amount of equipment that we had was typical of when my dress slacks had a stain in them. I would take a 5-gallon bucket of 100-octane gasoline, rinse out my slacks, and when I got the spot out of the slacks, I'd pour the gasoline out on the ground. Not very good attention to our environment at that time, but that was typical of the way we did things. We just had a lot of equipment and a lot of things that we had to work with. I'm going to stop just now and ask you if you have some questions. We love questions for either Vince or myself. Yes, sir.
I have a question for both of you. Did either of you date a nurse?
What?
Did either of you date a nurse?
Date a nurse?
Yeah.
No, but I was dancing with one on Capri one time, and someone cut in. And I looked, it was my co-pilot, and I was in the NCO club. I mean, he shouldn't have been in there. And I went back to my room and I found his uniform. He was a second lieutenant on my bed in the hotel room, so I put it on, and I was an officer for about 4 hours on Capri. I hated it. Did that answer you? Close to it.
I never dated a nurse. I won't tell you about the other. You got to remember, when you got a bunch of guys 18 to 25 years old, we had a question one time when we put on a symposium. A woman asked why we had all those Varga girls painted on the nose of our airplane. Now, they were pretty mild compared to the kind of photos we have of ladies today. But nobody answered her, so I said, what do you think guys 18 to 24 are thinking about when they don't fly? And she said, I don't have any idea. And I said, we're thinking about chasing babes. And unfortunately, that was the truth. It may not be what we're proud of, but that's what we did. Any other questions? We like questions, so yes, sir.
What are all those bombs on your chapter letters, or whatever.
A bomb for every mission.
Oh,
Yeah, the bombs.
Yeah. Incidentally, when we came home from the war, we put it behind us. We found a job, found a girlfriend, we got married, we had babies, and we did it in that order, as strange as it seems. And now, we grew up in a free country, a little bit of our own, each of us our own making, and now we're old and ugly. And if you have an uncle or a grandpa or somebody that served in any of these wars, don't wait till he's gone to ask him questions. Finally, people have tapped into those of us that were there, and now we're letting it all out. And that's the way it should be. So remember that. And you ask your mother questions. I wish I had mine back for just 20 minutes. Find out about my great aunt. I can't believe what they said about her. Go ahead.
Any other questions?
We have about 1 minute to get the photo done. If you want.
Okay.
Yes, sir?
What did you like most about being in the military?
I think I probably like the discipline. The discipline wasn't particularly tough for me. A lieutenant asked me when I was a cadet, he said, Mr. Clemens, when we were cadets, that's what they called the Mr. He said, Mr. Clemens, what do you think of the discipline? And I said, well, it's not too tough. And he said, how is that? And I said, I'll introduce you to my mother. We were brought up in a time during the Depression where discipline was very tough. And I like that in the service. That has served me well in the business world in the years since World War II.
Now we're going to next time.